Welcome to Tea Time with the Jackson Center. My name is Kristan McMahon, and I have the pleasure of serving as the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. We envision a world where the universal principles of equality, fairness, and justice prevail. 2021 is an important recognition year for Justice Jackson, for international humanitarian law, and for the Jackson Center itself. And during the course of this year, we are celebrating the 80th anniversary of Justice Jackson's appointment to the U.S. Supreme Court, the completion of the 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials and the birth of international humanitarian law, and the 20th anniversary of the Robert H. Jackson Center. And all of those milestones had us looking to the past to see how far we, the law, and the world have come. But we know that we cannot simply rest on our laurels. So it also sparked conversations regarding where are we and the law trying to go and how do we get there? And that's part of the story of how we got to our 2021 programming theme, The Work Left to Do. During this year, we are convening conversations about democracy, U.S. global institutions, human rights, equality, equity, and justice. We have structured our bi-monthly teas a wee bit differently this year. Each month has a particular focus, and in September, we are focused on disability justice and disability rights. And the first tea each month is geared to provide you with an understanding of the work left to do to achieve equity or make progress from a legal perspective. And the second tea each month, which this is geared to showcase those actively doing the work to close those gaps. And we hope each of these programs inspires you to have conversations with your family, friends, and colleagues, and to seek ways to make change in your own communities. To our live audience, please ask your questions as they occur to you during the course of our conversation today. And for those who are watching or listening to this later, please ask your questions in the comments and we will do our best to get you the answers. So today I am excited to be in conversation with Marcie Roth, the Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer, and Dawn Skaggs, the Emergency, Disaster, and Climate Resilience Specialist for the World Institute on Disability. WID's global mission is to continually advance the rights and opportunities of over 1 billion people with disabilities, and its goal is to operationalize inclusion by incubating and driving research and policy into action. Marcie and Dawn, thank you very much for joining me for tea today.
Thank you for having us, Kristan. We're very excited to be with you all and to have this opportunity to have tea together, although I'm sticking with water.
That's perfectly okay. The tea is my beverage of choice. You all can drink whatever makes you happy. So I like to start each of these with a foundational question. And so I'm going to ask each of you separately because your answers may differ, but I'd like to know, how do you define disability justice? And Marcie, I'm going to start with you on that.
So I think very simply, disability justice is, taking us beyond rights, taking us beyond people having to fight for what everybody else already has, and instead starting from a foundation that centers around the people most disproportionately affected. I have a real favorite quote from a member of a female member of Congress who is a person of color. And she said, the people closest to the pain should be the people closest to the power. And so when I think about disability justice, I think about shifting from who is at the center of, everything we do, so that it's the people who have the most significant disproportionate impact who are the ones for whom justice is everyone's priority.
That makes sense to me. A lot of the conversations we've had this year, regardless of the type of justice we're talking about, seem to have that same focus, that if the community is the one that's been impacted, the community gets to define what their version of justice is. And it's not a top-down pronouncement of this is what I think justice is for you. So I think that will really resonate with our audience. Dawn, what would be your answer to that question?
Well, very different, but very much the same. Fundamentally the same concepts. To me, disability justice is really not about providing justice. It's about opportunity. And when the focus is on, justice as an outcome, as a destination, we're missing a lot of the point. And if we instead focus on disability opportunity, we're really looking at an asset-based strategy rather than us providing empowerment or equity, where we really need to be shifting that focus to where are the resources in the community that can benefit the entire community, and allowing the opportunity for the production of that, for leadership opportunities, and ultimately decision-making opportunities, rather than just input or guidance or receipt of what's provided to them, allowing people to, along the same lines as you and Marcie both mentioned, allowing people to make the decisions that impact both themselves and others, to spread the wealth and improve the community at large.
So your answer makes me think of a follow-up question, which is along the lines of, are there fundamental changes to some of our structures and some of our systems then that need to be made in order to facilitate that version of justice or that version of opportunity?
Without a doubt. Clearly the ongoing failures within the existing systems that continue to result in people with disabilities, particularly Black, Indigenous, Brown, other people of color, being so disproportionately impacted that we cannot continue using the approaches that are so standard, whether it's because of civil rights laws and obligations, whether it's simply because it's the right thing to do, whether it's because it's a smart business practice. We have got to shift that paradigm away from continuing to do what we've done and then being shocked when we have the same results and people are very obviously discriminated against, left behind, excluded, erased.
Systemically, we have created a top-down strategy to our culture, and really to provide that opportunity, we're not talking as much about changing the law as changing the culture and changing where the values within our culture really lie. The law should reflect the culture. It really doesn't work very well when the law tries to lead the culture. So we're really looking at those fundamental assumptions of people and their capacity, and looking at how do we change that and do a paradigm shift from the pyramid structure to something that's really more reflective of who we are as people.
Okay, I like that. There was a was a statistic on your website that I found very illuminating, and I was trying to decide if it shocked me. And I think it was more that I'd never really thought of it in this way. But it was about the likelihood of people with a disability to be injured or killed in emergency, a disaster. I think those probably covered the two major impacts there. And it was that they are 2 to 4 times more likely to be injured or killed. And like I said, the more I thought about it, it made sense to me that, I'm not sure I would have put those exact numbers on it, but the fact that there is a greater likelihood made sense to me, because the abled community is not good about addressing these needs in the regular course. And it makes sense that that only gets exacerbated when something emergent or disastrous happens. And so Dawn, especially this is one of the reasons I was really interested in speaking with you all about this too, because we've been basically living in an emergency state for the last 18 months. And even within that emergency state, there have been disasters on top of that. And so Marcie, to your earlier point about the intersectionality and how that compounds challenges, this is, compound on compound on compound. So I'd love to talk to you both about how I guess both COVID, and then I'm also thinking, the recent hurricanes and things along that line, like how is this changing the conversation? Are people becoming more aware of the need to better plan and prepare? Is actually, rather than ask you 4 questions in a row, let me start there. So
Dawn, do you want to take the first round?
Sure. When we're talking specifically about COVID, it is a really great example. And it's a great opportunity for a lot of the things that we usually keep hidden behind the door have come out. And so it really has changed the conversation in that it's elevated and exposed and increased that awareness. Whether that awareness translates to something that's a change or it stays as awareness is really to some degree yet to be seen. Typically, what we've already seen is that the general public really doesn't think about disability justice until it affects them. And the universal experience of COVID has allowed that to happen, has allowed people to have temporary glimpses into some of the challenges, some of the barriers, some of the restrictions that a lot of other people, 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 people, live with on a daily basis. And it's been very interesting to watch, quite frankly, because some of the things that people feel really need to change are the things that affected them directly, but that have been affecting people with disabilities since the beginning and still do. In addition, some of the issues that people with disabilities face on a daily basis were truly exacerbated by COVID. The ability to access resources, the ability for equitable care in the medical setting, the ability to utilize some of the tools that they have and live with in order to live independently. A lot of those things were significantly impacted. An easy example of that would be people with a disability living independently in the community through the use of personal assistance services. And with the restrictions on getting close to each other, the restrictions on masking, the stay in your own home requirements, that changed those resources that a lot of people really relied on. And staying at home was not an inconvenience. It was not a challenge. It was potentially life impacting and potentially life threatening. So, you heard a lot about the inconveniences and the challenges to everybody because of some of the mandates. And yet we still need to drill down into that. We have touched the surface on that awareness, but we really haven't got to the point as a country where we are addressing the ripple effect of some of the decisions, and how do we, again, sort of flip that on its head so that it's not a ripple effect out, but we look at some of those most vulnerable, most marginally represented, disproportionately impacted populations, and how do we take what their needs are and implement that into general population rather than, having them be on the outskirts. Because what we typically find is when we do that, what's benefiting those populations the most and giving them the opportunity to participate in the problem solving also benefits other people who may not have such specific needs. So COVID has really been an eye-opener. We need to take some action on what we have learned through COVID. And we still have some challenges to go as people are beginning to enter back into communal living and public spaces. Some of those challenges are re-emerging as even larger than before, as people's liberties and needs come into conflict with each other. It's in the news every day, so I don't have to rehash it, but the people with a disability who are living with the additional challenges that are being impacted by COVID, we need to be looking at that. And how do we address those and then learn from that instead of trying to go back to what we were doing before that really wasn't necessarily working all that well.
And if I could add, you quoted a statistic of people with disabilities being 2 to 4 times more likely to be injured or to die in a disaster. And in fact, those data come from a study that was done after the Great East Japan earthquake. And that study was done by the UN. And what I want to sort of shift to is the current reality, which is in this current disaster that is COVID, people with disabilities have died at far greater numbers than even that earthquake and other disasters. So we are now at, I believe, just about 670,000 people have died from COVID in the US, a greater number than any other country on the face of the earth, but that's a whole separate conversation. What has just not gotten the attention that it really should have is the fact that of those 670,000 people who've died, a huge percentage, some have said as high as 95%, were, in fact, and these are CDC numbers, were people who are referred to as having underlying conditions or comorbidities, right? Or people who are vulnerable or fragile. Well, those are all euphemisms for that legal, civil rights protected class of people with disabilities. I don't think I'm being hyperbolic when I say I believe that well over 500,000 people with disabilities have died from COVID. And when you then really drill in to the people who've died in nursing homes, long-term care facilities, jails and prisons, group homes, psychiatric facilities, these are, again, CDC numbers. These are almost entirely 100%. I think it's 99.6% are people with disabilities. Wow.
Yeah.
And, we hear a lot of talk about, well, all those folks in nursing homes were old. Well, you don't go to a nursing home because you're old. You go to a nursing home because you have support needs that your community has failed to put in place and make available to you. And even though the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is 31 years old, and the key Olmstead Supreme Court decision, which clarified that people with disabilities have the right to live in the most integrated setting appropriate to their needs. And the Department of Justice has very clearly said that that is in almost every case not a congregate facility. And yet, this massive loss of life in congregate facilities, 200,000 people in congregate facilities, maybe more, because apparently the numbers have somehow gotten lost along the way. There are folks who, again, don't necessarily mean to be hyperbolic, but there are folks who are referring to this as a genocide of people with disabilities. And then when you take a look at co-occurring disasters, such as Hurricane Ida, and the movement of people from 7 nursing homes into a warehouse as a protective measure, and there was loss of life. These were folks, 850 people, all of them people with disabilities, because you don't go to a nursing home for any other reason. 850 people into a warehouse, mattresses on the floor, buckets for personal hygiene. Every single one of these people have hard-won civil rights protections, but without monitoring and enforcement, here we are. So, and we could certainly continue talking about that.
Well, and I feel, so there's I have a lot of different questions based on what you just said. So, I feel as if one of the things that seems to happen, this is a gut feeling for me, so please, by all means, correct me, is that when an emergency or when a disaster happens, there is some leeway that seems to be given of, yeah, we know that wasn't exactly right, but it was an emergency. What did you expect to happen? Or, if we had to design something on the fly, that was the best we could do. And so I think it is also part of your work to help people understand that didn't need to be designed on the fly, that, there should be plans in place that it's probably not as simple as this, but you basically open up the manual and say, what if there's a hurricane? What do I do? And so, Dawn, I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
As you can see by the body language, both Marcie and I are practically jumping out of our seats, because you're absolutely positively right. And it's not rocket science. Very simply, failing to plan is planning to fail. And disasters inherently reveal those weak spots in our daily life. And so it's really not this magic potion that we keep in a box or a binder that we keep on the shelf. It is applying those common sense principles and knowledge of what works on a daily basis, what is being done, and how are we going to intentionally replicate that when there's pieces of our system and our structure and our culture that get impacted by a disaster. So disasters really are a type of shock to the system, and they happen in all different ways, in pandemics, in natural disasters, in massive economic changes. They can happen in all capacities. And so a resilient community, which we are evidently not, is really anticipating that on a daily basis and looking at what are our resources, where can we find them, and how do we activate those in a disaster to really magnify the assets in our community and minimize the weaknesses. Historically, we see over and over, we don't do that. We maximize the weaknesses. And disasters really, people with disabilities are a perfect example of that. As you said, they are 2 to 4 times more likely to be injured or die in a disaster. And quite frankly, I believe, Marcie can correct me on this, but those numbers really just include the disaster, not the long-term recovery and the magnitude of life that's lost as we go through that recovery process. So those numbers are even higher when you look at from the impact of a disaster to getting back to a steady state or onto a new steady state. And that's a whole different conversation, but we're not inclusive in our community living on a daily basis. And so when a disaster happens, that's where we have a weak spot, and that gets exacerbated. And we don't plan inclusively when there are plans. And believe it or not, based on what you see, it might be hard to believe, but there are supposed to be plans in place for the hazards that may happen. But when we have that disaster, those plans frequently go out the window. When they're even utilized, the really big gap pertinent to this particular conversation is those plans have to be inclusive to start with. Mm-hmm. And typically we don't see that. When you look at the plans of an organization or a jurisdiction or a country, they don't account for people with disabilities. And therefore it should really not be surprising that we're seeing the data, the outcomes, and the results that we are. Because logical outcome of what we're doing on a daily basis and of our planning. You cannot include people in your response and address the needs in that moment if you haven't included them in the plan to begin with. And just for clarification before I let Marcie join me, including people in a plan does not mean using the word disability every once in a while. It means bringing people who are experts within the disability community about the disability community and both the needs and the assets, and bringing them to the table. Beyond bringing them to the table, using them as experts and really integrating the knowledge base that exists into what that plan should be and how should those responses be directed in an emergency. And unfortunately, we just don't see that. It's not happening. When people with disabilities are included, it is typically that they're planned for by taking them to a warehouse, or they're planned about by, saying people with disabilities also. So I could go on for the rest of our time.
Well, and Marcie, I'm guessing that your experience with FEMA as well, since that is part of your career in this space, also provides an interesting lens on this.
Well, it does, and let me just point out from a planning perspective, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 requires that every federal dollar spent by the federal government or by a grantee or sub-grantee must comply with physical accessibility, program accessibility, and equally effective communication accessibility. And the Department of Justice has made it entirely clear, and the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Health and Human Services, other federal agencies have explicitly noted that there are no waivers to those civil rights obligations in disasters. So you're absolutely right, Kristan, that, we get to the disaster and everybody's like, oh, I'm going to put that in the too hard box, right? When in fact, the states receive over $10 billion a year in planning funds. Every one of those planning dollars needs to comply with those civil rights obligations. So there are no waivers in disasters. Can't say these are unfunded mandates because those funds are provided every year. This year, even more so. There's, almost $4 billion that have gone to states for mitigation, hazard mitigation. Every one of those $4 billion needs to comply with physical access, program access, effective communication access. So when I was at FEMA, I was brought on board as senior advisor to the administrator for disability issues. And it was my responsibility to engage the community as partners in planning, responding, recovering, mitigating, preventing. And, we made huge progress over that period of time, almost 8 years that I was there. And quite honestly, much of that went out the window when a decision was made. We're not going to give people with disabilities who are experts that leadership role in disasters. They decided instead, we're going to just tell everybody that these are responsibilities, provide a little bit of training. I think a maximum of 30 minutes was what the department, the Government Accountability Office found. And we're just going to, our strategy for inclusion is going to be, we're going to teach everybody. Well, that's a great idea. Everybody does need to know, but you still need those disability experts at the front. Again, the people closest to the pain, Ayanna Pressley, the people closest to the pain are the ones who should be closest to the power.
We have a question from Nicole that if this feels like a good time to ask this. She said that she has been reading quite a bit about how COVID has opened up opportunities for disabled people or people with disabilities for remote work, especially in more developed countries. Mm-hmm. But now there seems to be a backtrack on those opportunities and accommodations since things are opening up. So her question really is, what can people with disabilities and their allies do to keep that momentum, to keep that awareness and conversation going about leveling the playing field? This is like an equity conversation versus, I think, an equality conversation for people with disabilities in the workforce to ensure that they continue to thrive and they continue to have those opportunities. Mm-hmm. What would you recommend?
First and foremost, while building back better is very catchy, we are actually strongly advocating that we build forward better, because building back, things weren't so great before COVID. So let's build forward. Let's look at what it's going to take to actually lift up the whole community in this unprecedented opportunity to, we've had this massive pause. It's had horrible impact. At the same time, as you said, we've learned some very interesting lessons. Many people who thought there was no way that remote work was a possibility are now, devotees to remote work. Just, case in point, the World Institute on Disability, when I first joined WID exactly 2 years ago, I had come, thank you very much. Thank you. It's been a wild 2 years. When I first came on board, I sort of innocently asked, what's our policy for remote work? And my colleagues said, oh, that wouldn't work here. And I said, well, yeah, actually, we're going to be moving in that direction. They're like, oh, you don't understand. That's just not possible. And having the leadership role, I said, well, actually, I'd like us to get started with that. Fortunate for us, we actually had made quite a bit of progress when, in fact, at the beginning of March, the San Francisco Bay Area was the first place to go into lockdown, or no, I guess we don't call it lockdown. Send everybody home, shelter in place, socially distance, whatever terms we were using then. And lo and behold, we were able to move to a remote work environment extremely smoothly. I know it wasn't as easy for a lot of other businesses. Obviously, there are a number of essential functions that cannot be done remotely in a number of workplaces. But for people with disabilities and people who don't have disabilities, as we have identified ways to optimize people's work performance, let's use those lessons. And for my organization, it's meant hiring Dawn, who's in Texas. I'm in Maryland. Our headquarters is in Berkeley, California. We've been able to hire highly skilled disabled people with expertise who we're not asking people to move. We're providing them with the accommodations that they need. We're making the modifications that they need. And satisfaction is far higher. Performance is through the roof. Of course, Dawn was up until midnight last night submitting a grant, and I'm just glad she didn't have to drive home afterwards.
Welcome to nonprofit life. Yes.
Yes, exactly. So,
Dawn, is there? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, so I'm done.
Dawn, is there anything you would like to add to that?
I would just like to build on it very briefly, because as Marcie mentioned and sort of came up earlier in the conversation, disasters are an opportunity to reset and to change the paradigm. And I think that's what Marcie is describing, that acceptance and embracing that as much as it would be tactically very easy, no, one size does not fit all. And I think in response to the question, that thinking change from an accommodation for people with disabilities to a growth opportunity. What did we learn about working remotely? Mm-hmm. And some of the things we learned were that it can be a better return on investment. It can mean the ability to gain greater expertise. It can mean the flexibility that gets you more efficient employees. So it is a tendency in our culture for, even within the disability community, to be requesting accommodations as an accommodation rather than a suggestion that is going to be universally beneficial to the organization or the community, whatever entity we're looking at, and really encouraging, coaching, and teaching those entities to embrace the new as a gain, as an additional strategy, rather than something special we do for someone who's asking. That's one of the great takeaways that we really need to be taking from this last 18 months.
Dawn, what you just described feels to me somewhat akin to conversations or guidance I feel that people are given when they're going in to ask for a raise. And it's sort of along the lines of, don't talk about how this benefits you or why you need the money. Give a more global perspective of, this is what it will enable me and others to do, or this is what you open up by enabling this particular accommodation. I have recently become a lot more sensitive to the language we use in this space as well. And Marcie, you alluded to this with the underlying vulnerabilities and comorbidities, and Dawn, you just alluded to this with as well, as it's not an accommodation, it's changing a perspective on how you get something done. And so do we do ourselves a disservice by the language that we have traditionally been using to talk about this? Do we need to be more, I'm not sure if it's forceful or focused, I don't really know what adjective I want there, or adverb, to really talk about this in a way that helps people understand this is not an other. This is a community member who, much like I have brown hair and somebody else has blonde hair, and it's not quite that surface, obviously, but it's, that's the level of difference perhaps that we should be thinking about it, as opposed to, this is me and I'm normal, and this is you and you are not. And so that was a lot of words to ask a question of, should we be using different language?
So, I think one of our biggest challenges is, again, we have these laws, and we are forced to use that legal language. And even then, we are so often denied our rights. If we move from a rights-based perspective to a disability justice way of thinking, then you're absolutely right. We don't need those words, but because we are miles away from a truly just world, we are forced to use those magic words. And even then, very often, those words are ignored, at best ignored.
And Dawn, that feels like a reference back to your earlier comment of, this is a cultural change, and as the culture changes, that will lead the law. So hopefully, as this becomes more regularized, less stigmatized, sort of two sides of the same coin there, perhaps that hopefully filters up into the law to change it to recognize the shift in the culture.
Yes, it's really, as Marcie articulated, it is a difference. We need to start where we're at. And unfortunately, where we're at is meeting baselines. And we need to continue to do that. And we need to use language that is familiar to people. And we need to familiarize people with the legal language to make sure we meet those baselines. Simultaneously, we need to be working on that other side of that same coin, which is changing the culture and understanding that those are baselines, those are minimums. And we are not aspiring to be at the minimum. What we need to be aspiring to is to affect that culture change where we are fully looking at universal inclusion. And that's not a layering on of disabilities. That is a different way of looking at the human existence, so that there is diversity and there's value in all of those diverse lives. But at the same time, we need to be working on those parallel, because we are where we are, and we can't bring people along until we get to go to where they are right now. And working on both of those simultaneously is really where we need to be. So it's language, and language reflects culture, but culture dictates language at the same time.
Absolutely. It's all part of the work left to do, which is why we're having this conversation. Because you are the World Institute on Disability, I also want to make sure we talk about some of the more global perspective of the work that you all are doing, before we get into some of our wrap-up questions. And a reminder to our audience, if you have questions, please do ask them at any time. So I have I think two questions I'm curious about. One, where does the United States sort of fit into the global handling of disability? And then more specifically, in some of the work that you all are doing with the Global Alliance for Disaster Resource Acceleration, I would love for you to talk a little bit about that. What is that, obviously, and then how is it working, and what is the ultimate goal of that group?
So with regard to global disability rights, in 2006, the UN put out for signature a convention on the rights of persons with disabilities, which is a treaty. Since that time, I think 192 countries have signed. Well, maybe it's not. I don't remember the exact numbers, but what I do know is there are 9 countries that have not ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And the US is one of those. And I hadn't planned to share this, but I think I have it here. Maybe I don't. The other countries are Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Cameroon. Can't think of the others, and the US. So when it comes to disability rights, we are very sadly excluding ourselves from what 160, 170 other countries are working together on. It's a huge misstep on our part.
Has there been a reason articulated as to why the United States has not signed?
Well, we've signed, but we haven't ratified.
Well, we've not ratified. Apologies. Yes, thank you.
So the reason that the Senate has not ratified is there are folks who believe that the Americans with Disabilities Act is sufficient. And there are folks who erroneously believe that ratifying the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities will somehow lessen the individual rights of parents who homeschool their children.
Okay. Would you like to talk a little bit about the Global Alliance for Disaster Resource Acceleration as well? I know you have a big program coming up tomorrow with Gallaudet University. And so would love for you to talk a little bit about what, is it GADRA? Is that how we pronounce the, okay, pronounce the acronym, what the work there is intended to do. And if you want to talk a little bit about the program tomorrow, that would be great.
And let me just interrupt and turn back for just a moment. It's actually 175 countries that have ratified, and the 9 that have not are Bhutan, Cameroon, Lebanon, Liechtenstein, Solomon Islands, Tajikistan, Tonga, Uzbekistan, and the US. Just
thank you.
Just wanted to put that out there.
I appreciate that. We always like clarity. So thank you.
Yes. And then I'll start briefly talking about why GADRA, and then Dawn can do a deeper dive. And maybe Dawn will talk about tomorrow's event. I've been working in disability and disaster for 20 years now. And over the past 20 years, I have seen time and again that local disability-led organizations are excluded from humanitarian relief. It is the humanitarian system is a charity model, and for disability-led organizations, what those local disaster impacted organizations need is resources to continue to provide the services to their local community. They don't need charity. They need support for continuity of operations and to be able to support their local community, people with and without disabilities. And just very briefly, it is those organizations on a daily basis, those local disability-led organizations who deal with emergencies, housing issues, transportation issues, healthcare issues, access to food and technology. They deal with that on a daily basis. So GADRA was created to bring those local experts together with corporate and foundation humanitarian relief to sort of cut through all of the other humanitarian layers and directly support those local organizations. So Dawn can tell you more about GADRA and what's coming up tomorrow.
Sure. Like Marcie said, it's really as a way of circumventing a strategy to circumventing the traditional disaster response. That is one way we have and will give to you. And some of the fallout of that is that eventually that fades away. And when that's the strategy, you don't build any internal capacity after a disaster. And the community at large is left less capable because those capacities have not been utilized or built internally, but there's been a dependence that's been built in as instead. And so GADRA is actually a project of WID in collaboration with 2 other disability-led organizations, the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies, and ONG Inclusiva, which is based in Chile. And those three organizations are really spearheading a twofold activity. One is really building the resilience and capacity of those disability-led organizations anywhere they happen to be in the world. And as Marcie so clearly demonstrated for us, the US really is not an exemplar in how we deal with people with disabilities in a disaster. And so it's very important within GADRA that it is not a US delivery to the other countries, but it is a collaborative. It's a melding of the minds, and it's a hub for that strategy, regardless of where in the world the disaster happens. And so it does, the second piece of that is in a disaster, it provides an avenue for those disability-led organizations to reach out, and GADRA as an entity connects them intentionally with a foundation or a corporation or someone who does want to support the disaster, but is socially responsible to recognize that the traditional way is maybe not the most effective or most responsible. And so connecting those two together, and then we step aside and there's an exchange of support. Sometimes it's financial, sometimes it's in other ways, and sometimes it is a long-term connection where an organization will support that disability-led organization to continue through the recovery process into the new steady state. And so those are the different pieces of it. One of the things that makes it very powerful is the engagement of some key support organizations and corporations from the inception. And we call them the Founder Circle. And they are really fantastic entities that want to be engaged in a socially responsible way. One of those is Gallaudet University, and they have engaged with GADRA since its beginning, but most recently collaborated to identify activities that are happening on a global level with deaf-led organizations and how they are being proactive, active, and true leaders with respect to disasters. And on September 24th, which is tomorrow, will be the first of a 3-part series of events that is called Deaf-Led Disaster Action. And that will be a phenomenal, monumental experience, not to oversell, because it is pulling together 3 different countries, deaf-led organizations from Japan, Vietnam, and Trinidad and Tobago, providing a panel webinar on what they are doing that is really fairly revolutionary in the activities they're taking within their countries. The other piece of it that is absolutely astronomically impressive is that it will be translated into all of those languages and into multiple sign language opportunities. So we have already over 300 people registered. So I would encourage your listeners to jump on the info@GADRA website, or just the GADRA website, and click on the link to register and really engage. It's going to be an incredible learning opportunity, both for disabilities and disasters and disability-led organization capacity, as well as deaf-led roles in disaster, and an exemplar of how you might conduct an event with multiple languages all around the world in multiple time zones with multiple accommodations and multiple signs. And it's going to be a very, very interesting, great, and significant event.
Wonderful. Thank you for previewing.
And I've talked myself out of time.
No, that's perfect. We are going to move to the lightning round though. So these are designed to be short answers. Although I'm going to ask a slightly longer one first, because one of the questions I often have is, what do the experts in these areas see as the biggest priorities? So when we're talking about closing equity gaps or moving towards better disability justice, greater disability justice, what do you see as the biggest priorities for this work?
First and foremost, every single person needs to have the support and services they need in order to live in the community, in their home, with the degree of independence that they individually choose.
Okay.
I would echo that in that it is, first and foremost, it is the opportunity for inclusion. And that requires flexibility systemically for us to really allow people to create what is going to work for them rather than making a box that they need to fit in.
That makes perfect sense to me. All right. So what progress do you hope to see in the next year? So if we need to break that down into, this is what we think we can do in the next year, what does that look like?
In the next year, all of the important conversations about infrastructure, all of the important conversations about healthcare, about folks being able to get the supports and services that they need, time to end the discussion and make real the priorities. There are two pieces of legislation. One is called the READY Act, Real Emergency Access for Aging and Disability Inclusion for Disasters Act, bipartisan, bicameral. The second piece of legislation is the Disaster Relief Medicaid Act. This one would make it possible for people who have to evacuate in disasters across state lines to still have Medicaid throughout that disaster. So in the next year, pass all of these bills and let's get down to the work of implementation.
Okay. Dawn, what progress do you hope to see in the next year?
I would like to see, on a real practical level, I would like to see a quantifiable difference in representation of people with disabilities within, not as representatives of people with disabilities, but with skill sets that they bring to the table and demonstrating, modeling, as well as speaking to the resources, capacity, and intelligence and knowledge that can be shared to improve the system from within.
Okay. And Dawn, I'm going to start with you with the follow-up question. What gives you hope that progress will be made?
Of course, the activities of the World Institute on Disability, but in addition, the partners that we have, the other agencies, the other disability-led organizations that are doing parallel types of things and coming at these needs from a multitude of different places to really make an impact, I think is what gives me hope that there is potential for that. It is a community effort, and I think we are taking the community approach.
Okay. Marcie, what gives you hope that progress
What
will
gives me hope is seeing how many young emerging leaders, particularly Black and Brown and Indigenous disabled people who, many of them are ADA generation. They've always had the Americans with Disabilities Act. And they are stepping in, stepping up, rolling in, rolling up. That gives me tremendous hope.
Okay. Marcie, I'll start this question with you. Who else is doing good work to make progress?
We are absolutely so proud to be working alongside the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies and Inclusiva, as well the APRIL, which is the Association of Programs in Rural Independent Living. We are absolutely thrilled to be working with a new group, which is called DisData, which is working on the numbers, the facts, to support our work. Another organization, collaborative, called Silver, which is focusing on relocating people with disabilities out of congregate facilities. I could go on, but
that's a good start.
Yeah.
Dawn, who would you add to the list?
Slightly different theme. I would add the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management.
Yes.
Who begins from the racial equity perspective, but has gone incredible lengths and making some fantastic inroads to change emergency management as an industry.
Yeah, okay, great. All right, and then the last thing, we like to leave our audience with ideas that they can follow up on, people they can follow, books they can read. So any recommendations of articles or books or podcasts or thinkers that you all pay attention to? Marcie, I'll start with you on that.
Okay, well, first and foremost, WID has a fabulous podcast series. We would love for folks to join our podcast at wid.org, also on Facebook and LinkedIn and Instagram. A couple of my favorite books, two are from one of WID's founders, Judy Heumann. One of them is called Being Human, an unrepentant memoir of a disability rights activist. And the second, just published, is Rolling Warrior, the incredible, sometimes awkward, true story of a rebel girl on wheels who helped spark a revolution. The third is a book also just published, and it's so good. And it's by Emily Ladau, and it's called Demystifying Disability: What to Know, What to Say, and How to Be an Ally. And then last but not least, if you haven't seen Crip Camp, the Oscar-nominated story of Judy Heumann and lots of other folks, and the history of the disability rights movement, highly recommend Crip Camp. And a movie about Judy's life is in the process of happening. And Ali Stroker, who recently won a Tony Award, will be playing Judy. So those are some of my favorites.
Wonderful. All right, Dawn, what would you add?
I'm not sure how much time your listeners have to read, so I'm going to take a different strategy. And I would recommend, of course, the podcasts that are on WID's website, but also in terms of looking, there are a number of really fantastic journal articles, peer-reviewed journal articles that are being developed, and many of those are coming out of the University Centers for Excellence in Disability Studies. Mm-hmm. And there is one person in particular who has done some research as well as some books, and that is Dr. Steve Brown. And he published The Voices of the Disability Community and several others. But there's also the Journal of Disability Research, and that is a peer-reviewed academic journal that does talk extensively about disability justice and equity and strategies to include people with disabilities in disasters. So going to those UCEDs, University Centers for Excellence in Disability, who all have a different perspective on things, but several of them are really involved in disability studies in terms of journal articles. There's some really incredible data that can be mined in those locations.
Thank you for the recommendations. I appreciate that. So thank you to our audience for joining us for tea today. A couple of upcoming program notes so you can mark your calendars. And all of these are free programs, as all of our programs are. So in October, we are focused on international humanitarian law. And the majority of the programs will be happening outside of our normal tea time hours. So definitely go to the Jackson Center website for more information on these. But on September 30th and October 1st, we are offering 2 webinars in partnership with the International Nuremberg Principles Academy to really commemorate the completion of the 75th anniversary of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. The programs are largely set for European time. So on the 30th, it starts at 8 a.m. Eastern. On the 1st, it starts at 9 a.m. Eastern, which is very early for most people. But the first panel will be speaking on the legal aspects of the Nuremberg judgment as a precedent for the evolution of the field of international criminal law. And on the 1st, they will be discussing the legal implication of the Nuremberg judgment for prosecutors today. So really how the law evolved and how it's living in the world today. Then on October 7th at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, we have partnered with the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum and the Truman Library Institute to offer a webinar called 75 Years Since the Nuremberg Trial, What It Was and Why It Matters. And Professor John Q. Barrett, Professor of Law at St. John's University School of Law, and our Elizabeth S. Linney Fellow, and Dr. Joseph Ross, who is a teaching assistant professor for peace, war, and defense at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, will be our 2 featured guests. And Dr. Kurt Graham, the director of the Truman Library, and I will also be adding our thoughts. And then on October 21st, we're having a half-day webinar/seminar called Cold War Secrets Revealed. The featured guest is David Gill, who is the Consul General for the Federal Republic of Germany in New York. And he will speak about his experiences in East Germany when the Berlin Wall fell. That day also includes Professor Arthur Downey, who is the author of The Cold War, Law, Lawyers, Spies, and Crises. Nancy Thorndike Greenspan, the author of Atomic Spy, The Dark Lives of Klaus Fuchs, and Eli Rosenbaum, our friend, and the Director of Human Rights Enforcement Strategy and Policy for the U.S. Department of Justice. You can register for all of these programs on our website. That last one on the 21st is actually a hybrid. So if you would like to come to Jamestown and be here in person, you are more than welcome, but you can also attend virtually. Marcie and Dawn, thank you so very much for being with us and sharing your thoughts and for challenging us. And we know that these conversations never really end and we have a lot of work that we all need to keep doing, but appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. This was a really great opportunity in honor of Justice Jackson and all of the incredible work that you all are doing. We really appreciate it and welcome every opportunity to keep the dialogue going.
Thank you very much. I always enjoy that part of the continuing conversation.
Thank you, Kristan.